Hello and welcome back. And my name is Nathan House, and I am with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that'd be great. So we're going to be back in Romans chapters. We've been looking at chapters 9 through 11. I haven't done a video in a week or two, but we're going to be actually in the end of chapter 11 today, finishing up chapter 11. But Romans 9 through 11 is part of one larger unit that is dealing with the place of the nation of Israel, the place of the Jews in the plan of God. And so that's primarily what chapters 9 to 11 have been dealing with. What is their place? If they are the chosen, the elect, and they have all of these things Paul talks about, right? You have the patriarchs, you have the promises. And so the question kind of has become, if that's the case, then why is the majority of the Israelite nation, why are the majority of the Jews then not right with God, right? Why are they not following God's plan? And so there's kind of been this lengthy discussion that actually starts earlier in the book of Romans, but returns to this discussion in chapters 9 through 11. So we're going to kind of be wrapping that up today. And in fact, wrapping up the first 11 chapters. And again, the book of Romans is kind of divided nicely into two sections, right? More than half, the first 11 chapters are dealing with theology, teaching, doctrine. And then the last half, beginning in chapter 12, are really about how do you apply these things. It's very applicable, very real life. And so today we're going to wrap up the first 11 chapters. I have on the screen here just a picture of a tree with some things grafted in. We here in Central Valley of California, it's very agricultural, just very similar to ancient Palestine, very similar to modern Palestine. My wife and I visited there a few years ago, and it's like almost as if you were still in the Central Valley of California. Almond trees everywhere, and one of the common practices here with our produce, with our agriculture, is grafting is a normal thing where they take a tree and then they graft something that doesn't belong to it. For almonds, for example, they'll use a peach tree root, and then they'll graft almond trees on top of it because the peach tree root has some qualities that they're trying to capture. And so the grafting in, it's putting something on a tree that doesn't really belong there. And so we're going to see today that the Gentiles, they didn't really, from a physical standpoint, right? They didn't belong on this tree, this family tree, this lineage, if you will, based on the promises given to Abraham, and ultimately, I think most significantly, the promise of the seed to come, which was Jesus Christ. So we have these Gentile believers who, from a physical standpoint, didn't belong on there, but God grafted them in. Paul uses this agricultural image. And the Jews who didn't believe in Christ, they were broken off. And so this is really the thrust of what we'll see today. We're going to go through a few other things, but ultimately this is where we're going to get to. I know we're in Romans, but I want to start here in Colossians. I want you just to see this, talking about Jesus Christ. He has now reconciled in his body of flesh, right? Jesus' body, by his death. He is reconciled in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before God. So all of these things, right, to be presented by Jesus Christ as holy and blameless and above reproach. I think this is before God. But this presentation by Jesus Christ to God, what is it contingent upon? It's contingent upon this: if indeed you continue in the faith. It's contingent upon your remaining. Right, that word continue, this Greek word, we're going to see this in a minute. It's this word to remain, to stay, to continue, to not be moved, right? Continue where? In the faith. So these two words, we're going to see that Paul will use them. He's using them here in Colossians. He's going to use them again today in the book of Romans. So we're going to see that here in a moment. But again, remember, this is part of a larger context dealing with God's place of Israel in his plan. We're going to see today two primary things. Hope for the Jewish nation. Again, Paul has been kind of, upset about the Jewish nation. They're not in the right relationship with God. I wish I could save some of them. So Paul has been kind of saying they're not right. But we're going to see that from today's text, there is still hope for the Jewish nation. We're also going to see a warning for the Gentile nation. Again, the church in Rome was a church that was dealing with Jew and Gentiles being, kind of infused together into Christianity, coming from Judaism, coming from paganism. And so for the churches, the multiple churches in the city of Rome, there certainly was some challenges as they tried to grow as Christians, not as Jews separated from Gentiles, but as Christians together. And so there are definitely some reminders for both Jews and Gentiles that they will need to hear. So let's go ahead and look at this beginning in Romans chapter 11, verse 6. We're going to see what I called Israel's failures. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of work. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace, right? If you're right with God based off of works, then it's not a gift, right? The idea of grace being something given to you that you didn't deserve. If you're right with God based off of works, then you weren't given a gift, you earned it. But that wouldn't be grace. So it's not based off, it is no longer on the basis of works. Again, that's something we've already talked about. But let's go on. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. And so what was Israel seeking? Well, if you go back to Romans chapter 10, again, same unit of thought, right? 9 through 11, chapters 9 through 11. You go back to chapter 10, verse 3, what do we see? For being ignorant of the righteousness of God, he's talking about the Israelites. They were ignorant of the righteousness of God, and they were seeking. So here's that word, seeking. They were seeking to establish their own righteousness, and in doing so, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So Israel's failure is that they were trying to earn righteousness. They weren't trying to, they were ignorant of God's righteousness. They were seeking to establish their own. They didn't submit to God's righteousness. But in seeking to establish their own, watch, I'll come down here. In seeking to establish their own, they failed to obtain what they were seeking, because they can't obtain it on their own. They can't earn it. They can't place God in debt to them. So Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. So then Paul now will quote from a couple of Old Testament passages. He's in a quote from the book of Isaiah, the book of Deuteronomy. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, and this is from Psalm 69, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see and bend their backs forever. So the kind of the cumulative effect of these passages here, these Old Testament texts, really serves kind of as a warning to Israel. The nation of Israel, Deuteronomy 29, verse 4, I think it's Deuteronomy 29, 4 that's blended here with Isaiah 29. For example, in Deuteronomy 29, Moses is speaking to the descendants of that first generation that came out of Egyptian bondage, right? That first generation that left Egypt, that wandered in the wilderness, that saw the plagues, that saw the water, the Red Sea parted, that saw the pillar of fire, the pillar of smoke. They saw all these miracles, God providing water for them in the wilderness, manna from heaven. And yet they got to the promised land and they said, we can't do it, right? God's not big enough. We're not big enough. And so, of course, we remember that God condemned them to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So in Deuteronomy 29:4, where this comes from, Moses is speaking to their children. And again, it's like it's a reminder, right? Don't be like your parents were. Your parents, they had eyes, but they didn't see things, right? They had ears, they didn't hear. And so don't be like them. Can you imagine how much different was it for the Jews of the time of Jesus? The Jews at the time of Christ, they saw the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. They saw the raising from the dead. They saw the demonics being cast out. They saw these things, just like the Israelites in the wilderness saw those things, and yet they still didn't believe, right? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking because they couldn't place their faith in God. They couldn't place their faith in Jesus Christ. And so they were going to fail to obtain. Here's taken out of a commentary that I have, this little image. So we have, again, who is it that is right with God? This goes back to earlier in Romans chapter 11, and I even referenced the report of the suffering servant, right? Paul talks about this. He talks about that Isaiah 53, that Isaiah 52 verse 7, Isaiah 53 verse 1, that there was this message of the suffering servant. And Paul asked the question, quoting Isaiah, who believes this? Who believes this report of a suffering servant that was to come? And for those Jews who believe, those Gentiles who believe, they're saved, right? They're right with God. But for those Jews who reject the suffering servant, for those Jews, let's go back here real quickly. Look at this. Go back again, chapters 9 through 11, one unit, right? They have stumbled, talking about the Jews, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone. Well, the stumbling stone is Jesus Christ. God says, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Whoever believes in him won't be put to shame. But see, many of the Jews rejected God's stone. They didn't want the stone of God. And so we come down here again, here, and we see here in, let's just pick up in verse 9. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, with the mouth one confesses and is saved. And so then it says down here, verse 15, and how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, so Isaiah 52:7, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. So we're introduced to this concept of the good news. Well, what was the good news? The suffering servant. Isaiah 52:7, the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, but they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah, he quotes Isaiah again. Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing. Hearing what? The message of Christ, the message of the suffering servant. But the question that Isaiah asked, and Paul echoes, is who believes that report? Who has believed the report? And so those who believe the report of the suffering servant, they're part of that saved group. They're the ones who aren't stumbling over the stumbling stone. So several images kind of that are coming together in chapters 9 to 11. A stone that causes someone to stumble, a suffering servant, this tree, right? That family tree. All these images kind of coming together. And the problem has been the Jews have rejected the stone. The Jews have rejected the suffering servant. The Jews have not believed in that promise of Jesus Christ. So let's come back to Romans chapter 11. We're going to see excluded and included. So the Jews are excluded. The Jews are excluded. The Gentiles are included. It says, so I asked, did they, the Israelites, the Jews, stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. And so Paul talks about here the Gentiles being included, the Israelites being excluded. Well, why? And again, big picture. What have we seen over and over in Paul's writings? Because the Jews did not believe they were excluded. So the question then becomes, why are the Gentiles included? Because of faith. And we'll see that more clearly in just a minute. But Paul alludes to this, the Gentiles being used by God to make the Jews jealous. We see this Gentile inclusion, and we see this very much in the book of Acts. And in fact, in Acts 13, Paul's missionary trip here with Barnabas, it begins in the synagogues. Acts 13, right? I'm going to hop over here real quickly and show you that. It begins in the synagogues. So they, talking about Paul and his companions, they went on from Perga. They came to Antioch in Pisidia, and on the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat down. So Paul goes where? He goes to the Jews here in Antioch, Pisidia, and him and Barnabas teach the Jews. So then we come down here in this account of Antioch and Pisidia. Let's keep going in here a little bit, see if I can get this thing to move a little quicker here. And it says, and as they went out, the people begged that these things might be told to them the next Sabbath. And after the meeting of the synagogue broke up, many Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas. So some of those Jews and some people who converted to Judaism heard Paul and heard Barnabas, and they followed them. The next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered together to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began to contradict what was spoken by Paul, reviling him. And Paul and Barnabas spoke out, saying, it was necessary that the word of God be spoken first to you Jews, since you Jews thrust it aside and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life. Watch this. Behold, we, the apostle Paul, this Jewish apostle, behold, we are turning to the Gentiles. And when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord. And as many as were appointed to eternal life believed. So what we see is a pattern. Paul alludes to the Jews being jealous of the Gentiles and hopefully using that jealousy to save some of the Jews. But Paul alludes to this in Romans chapter 11. We see this played out in a very real way in the book of Acts. And we see similar patterns of Jewish rejection and Gentile inclusion in numerous other passages in Acts as well. You can read those on your own if you would like. So this is where I really want to get today. Spent a lot of time to get there, right? We are in the tree through faith. So just like that stumbling stone was an image, here is another image that Paul uses, this tree, this root. So let's get into this. But if some of the branches, right, the Jews, go back to our image here, they were broken off, right? But if some of the branches were broken off so now Paul speaks to the Gentiles, right? He began speaking to the Gentiles in the previous paragraph, if you will. And you, although a wild shoot, you were grafted in. Go back to our image, right? You were grafted in. You weren't a part of it naturally, but you were grafted in among the others. And watch the result. Watch this beautiful thing. You now share in the nourishing root. So this word nourishing is something that means fatness or thickness. I think ESV does a good job translating here as nourishing, the idea being, like you ever prune anything, that you prune something, it comes off that root that is, if it's not attached to that anymore, it shrivels up and it dies, right? You have to stay attached to the nourishing root. And so those that were grafted in, they're sharing in that nourishing root. Those promises given to Abraham, specifically the promise of the Christ, the seed who was to come, they now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. So now this warning to the Gentiles, right? I said as we began, I said there's hope for the Jews and a warning for the Gentiles. Here's the warning to the Gentiles. Don't be arrogant, right? Don't be arrogant towards the branches, Gentiles. If you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. Then you will say, Gentiles, this is what you're going to say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That's true, Paul says. They were broken off. Why were they broken off? Again, big picture. What has Paul been hammering? They were broken off because of their unbelief. So I began this in the book of Colossians, right? I said they continue through faith, right? Faith and belief are the same root word in the Greek. Let me see if I can come back here. They were broken off because of their lack of faith, because of their unbelief, because they didn't accept the stone. They didn't accept the suffering servant, right? They rejected it. They were broken off from that family tree. But you, Gentiles, you stand fast. Again, that word continue in the book of Colossians, right? Here he uses something different. But you stand fast through faith. So what is the requirement to being a part of the tree? It's faith. If you don't have it, you're broken off. If you have it, you remain. So he says, so don't become proud, right? Don't be arrogant. Don't be proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. So again, here is a warning to the Gentiles. Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, right? They're cut off. Their unbelief has cut them off. Not that God did this because God was, angry and or hated them, but their unbelief has caused them to be cut off. Their unbelief has caused them to fall. He said, but God's kindness towards you Gentiles provided. So here's that word continue that we saw in Colossians, right? Here's that word. Provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. So here's that warning to the Gentiles. And what is the warning? Stay attached to the root. I started as A to the vine. Stay attached to the root. Too many people want to become Christians but not be a part of the root. I don't want to go to church regularly. I don't want to be in the Word regularly. I don't want to have a relationship with other Christians. I'm going to be attached, but I'm not going to be really attached. You're not attached to the nourishing root. You're not going to do well. You're going to shrivel up and die. He says, otherwise, continue, otherwise you too will be cut off. So here's the hope for the Jews. And even they, the Jews, if they do not continue in their unbelief, right? What is the key to being attached to the tree? It's faith. If they don't continue, here's that word continue, if they don't continue in their unbelief, they can be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. How amazing is that? And that's the point. There's the hope, right? The warning for the Gentiles, don't be arrogant. Be thankful for your position. Be aware of the fact that you were grafted in, contrary to nature, into these promises. Be humble in that position. Again, these churches in Rome would have been trying to, blend people from various backgrounds coming together. Don't be arrogant towards those branches. God can graft them in again. And certainly some of the Jews were in that tree, Many of them were. Now, it was a small percentage of the whole. Paul uses the expression remnant over and over, doesn't he? But there was a remnant. And so real quickly, let's go back here to Romans chapter 11. And I want you to see something else. So where are we at? He says, the elect obtained it. I'm going to lose my spot. Okay, here's where I was going to go. So now I am speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, watch this, in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, watch this, and save some of them. So many of the Jews, most of the Jews were not in a saved state. But as Paul talked about earlier when he referenced Elijah and that remnant, right? There is a remnant that are still there by faith who haven't, to go to the Old Testament, they haven't bowed their knee to Baal. So we as Christians, what is this message for us? We need to remain attached. Whether you are a Jewish Christian or a Gentile Christian, we have to remain attached to that nourishing root. We can't thrive outside of it. We can't grow as Christians outside of that root, that promise, that family tree of God, right? This is where this is where the faithful are. This is where the faithful are. Those who are unfaithful have been broken off. Those who have faith have been grafted in. Be where you're at. Be where you should be. Remain attached to the tree. So there's the lesson today. Remain attached to the tree. Continue in the faith. Hardships may come, struggles may come, but let's be a part of that tree. Let's be in services. You know, way too many times people want to rush someone into baptism, get them in there, and sometimes people have a mentality, a thought that baptism is the end of the goal. No, baptism is the beginning of the relationship. We begin that relationship with Christ in baptism, and we have to stay attached to Christ. We have to stay attached through faith. And that's part of our Christian walk, right? It's going to services. It's being in the Word. It's being in prayer. It's having fellowship with others. We have to stay attached to that promise. Ultimately, that greatest promise is Jesus Christ. Stay attached. Be where you need to be. Remain strong. Remain in that nourishing root. I pray you have a good day. God bless.